except that we're bigger and better and stronger. But we grow up in this country singing the Star-Spangled Banner and, liberty and justice for pledging allegiance and all of that. We grow up with the idea that we are special, we are different, we are the Boy Scouts of the world. We help countries across the street. We're good. We have our little problems, like slavery, maybe. Maybe we weren't nice to the Native Americans. We have our little problems, but basically we're okay. Well, when you look at the history of this country, we were not. We were not. We destroyed Indian civilizations. We expanded into the Caribbean. We expanded into the Pacific. We sent our young people to war again and again. We did not take care of poor people. When poor people organized, and when workers organized into unions and went out on strike, the government called out the police and the National Guard and the Army to suppress their strikes. That's the history of labor struggles in this country. So it's not the kind of glorifying history that too many of us, grew up with. And when I say that, and when anybody says something like that, there's a kind of fear of saying it. You're putting down our country. You're unpatriotic. No, I'm not putting down our country when I am honest about what our government has done. I'm putting down our government, yes, but there's a distinction between the government and the country. It's a very fundamental principle of democracy that the government and the country are not the same. The government and the people are not the same. That's the basic idea of the Declaration of Independence, which says governments are set up by the people. They're artificial creations. They're set up to achieve certain ends, the right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, equality. And when governments become destructive of those ends, according to the words of the Declaration of Independence, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish the government. That's serious. Those are revolutionary words. But after all, it was a revolution. And there's something about a revolution that brings out some honesty and also brings out the idealistic language and hopes and dreams which may not be realized. Because, no, the dream of the Declaration of Independence was not realized, but it's there. It's telling us that governments are not to be obeyed simply because they're governments. To be patriotic is not to simply do what the government says. To be patriotic is to subscribe to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, to check up on the government to see if it really is fulfilling its obligation to take care of our right to equality, to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Patriotism, in the best sense of the term, means following those principles. And when the government doesn't follow those principles, the government is being unpatriotic. So we must be honest about ourselves, about our history, about the history of our government. And I think that we need some confession on the part of our government leaders, an acknowledgement, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, where they get up before, and confess, and maybe Cheney and Bush and the others should get up, form a group called Imperialists Anonymous, and tell the truth, and that is what they're aiming for in the Middle East is not democracy and not liberty. And they don't really care about the overthrow of tyrants like Saddam Hussein. Our government has supported tyrants all over the world. No, what they really care about, it's hard to say this, isn't it? Oil. It seems so mean, so cheap, although the oil won't be cheap. But it seems, really it's just oil? Yes, it's oil. History comes in handy there. The history of American policy towards the Middle East has been based on the desire to control the oil resources of the Middle East. That's been true ever since the end of World War II. Ever since President Roosevelt got together with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia, and they made a deal, The United States will replace the old oil powers, the Dutch and the British and the French in the Middle East. And in return, the United States will support the Ibn Saud government. Talk about democracy. The Ibn Saud government, the Saudi government, government of Saudi Arabia, all these years has been as far from democracy as you can find. But we did not invade Saudi Arabia to give democracy to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia gives us oil and is our ally in our quest for oil in the Middle East. So yes, history is very useful, in all of these ways. And I guess our problem is, once we accept what the reality is, once we look honestly at what we have done and what we're doing, and the question is, what do we do about it? And are we helpless to do anything about it? Because I think that's a great problem, that people, even when they oppose the government, feel helpless to do anything about it. And so we don't see today, although most Americans today are opposed to the war, and most Americans today are opposed to the Bush policies, we don't see a connection between that opposition and any kind of change in policy. We don't see the wishes of the people represented in what the government does. We are not seeing the kind of actions that took place during the Vietnam War, where the passive opposition to the war became more than passive when it became civil disobedience. We're seeing the beginnings of that with soldiers who are refusing to go back to Iraq. We are. We're seeing the beginnings of that with the families of soldiers saying, no, we are opposed to this war. But the fact is, we do not have democracy in foreign policy. That's a very important thing to acknowledge, because we're always talking about bringing democracy everywhere else. We do not have democracy in this country when it comes to foreign policy. We learn in school we have three branches of government, and we have checks and balances, and the legislator will check the, executive, and the Supreme Court will see if things are constitutional or not. That doesn't work in foreign policy. The president decides on war, and Congress goes along like a bunch of sheep. Really, that's what they did in the Mexican War. That's what they did in the Spanish-American War. That's what they did in World War I. That's what they did in the Vietnam War. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Did members of Congress know where the Gulf of Tonkin was when they voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution? Did they know what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin? It turned out to be a mess of lies. But they immediately voted to give Lyndon Johnson the authority to launch what then became a very long war in Vietnam. There's no democracy in matters of foreign policy. And no checks and balances. No hope that Congress will stop and say, hey, let's look into this. Let's see if this is true. And then, no. And no hope for the Supreme Court deciding that a war is unconstitutional. And we have not fought a constitutional war since the end of World War II. Constitution requires that Congress declare war. Congress has not declared war in any war that we have fought, of the many since World War II. Well, you learn in school, if something is unconstitutional, it's the job of the Supreme Court to say so and do something about it. No. After all, who are the Supreme Court? Just because they wear black robes doesn't give them any special moral standing. They are political appointees, and they do the bidding of the people who appointed them. So if they don't have democracy in the upper reaches of government, if we can't depend on checks and balances on representative government, that, well, obviously, I think, leads us to the thought that if we're going to have democracy, it depends on us, it depends on the people. And historically, that's been the situation. Historically, when working people found out that the government is not going to do anything about the 12-hour day, they organized, they went out on strike, and they won the 8-hour day. When black people in the South saw that the government, not just the state governments, but the national government, was not going to do anything about racial segregation or brutality in the South, then black people organized They demonstrated. They went to prison. They were beaten. Some of them were killed. But they created a national commotion which finally brought democracy alive. And that's the situation we're in today. We need to bring democracy alive today, and it requires the actions of ordinary people. And we mustn't despair about the fact that the government has all the power. The government has the FBI. They have all their secret apparatus. They are watching us. I don't think I'm paranoid. They really are watching us. And they love that. So our job is to watch them. And we have to understand that despite all the trappings of government which indicate that they are all powerful, they have the military, they have the money, they have the security apparatus and so on, fact is, historically, and here's where history comes in handy, the most powerful governments have had to change policy when the people demanded it. When an outcry grew so great, when the pressure from below grew so great that it became threatening to the government, then the government had to change policy. We have seen governments toppled. We have seen tyrannies toppled all over the world that seem to be impregnable. In the Philippines, suddenly, a dictatorship. Marcos is totally in charge. He wakes up one morning, and there are 1 million people in the streets. He leaves. Really. This has happened in place after place. In Haiti, Duvalier jumps on a plane. Quick, get out of here, because the people are rising up. The fact is, governments, like all powerful entities, are vulnerable. The government needs people to obey it in order to keep power. When people stop obeying, the government loses its power. Corporations need people to work for it. When people stop working for corporations, then the corporation is helpless. We saw this in the 1930s, General Motors and Ford, huge corporations. We're not going to have a union here. But when the workers left the factories, or even when they sat in the factories and wouldn't let production go on, General Motors was helpless. And so it's important to keep in mind that the power of the establishment rests on our obedience. When we start disobeying, and that's where Thoreau comes in, and that's where the great people in our history come in. That's where Helen Keller comes in, and Emma Goldman comes in, and Mark Twain comes in, and Eugene Debs, and Fannie Lou Hamer, and Martin Luther King. That's where they come in. When that happens, then something will change. And our job is to participate in that process. At this point, to light a fire under these wishy-washy Democrats who have just won an election and who are sort of falling back timidly, and they want to pass non-binding resolutions. How about a binding resolution? How about, yes, how about holding hearings on impeachment? Impeachment. I'm talking about a double impeachment. I'm talking Bush and Cheney because, they go together. And no, impeachment is not a radical solution. Some people act as, impeachment. They tremble at the thought of impeachment. Some people up, in the high reaches of the Democratic Party, we mustn't talk about impeachment. Impeachment is a constitutional measure. It's right there in the Constitution. The president may be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. What Bush has done does that not match the requirement of high crimes and misdemeanors? Sending us into war, lying to us, taking away our liberties, taking away the lives of thousands of Americans and subjecting so many of them to mutilation and a terrible future. Does that not meet the requirement of high crimes? We have to talk to our congressmen or congresswomen. We have to talk to them, but let them know how we feel. We have to beef them up and stiffen their spine and tell them to get going because it's a situation that cannot be tolerated for too long. I have to stop soon because I have to give you a chance. And although the orthodox definition of free speech is that the speaker speaks for 50 minutes and gives the audience 5 minutes, freedom of speech. Freedom of speech means, the president can speak to 30 million people. I can speak to a few hundred. It's a free country. Keep this in mind about power, and keep this in mind about when the government says, when Bush says, oh, we will not retreat. We will not give in. We will stay the course no matter what. Oh, they ask him, what about the people? What about the fact that most people are opposed to this? Well, that doesn't bother me. Well, we've seen that in history. We've seen people say, oh, I will never yield. I will never give in. And they gave in. When enough people got together, when enough people organized, they gave in. We've seen that again and again. I remember George Wallace getting up before a crowd of his Southern supporters and saying, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, and wild applause. 2 years later, the segregation signs were down in the South, and Wallace was campaigning in the black neighborhoods for support in his presidential race. Things change. Things change. It's up to us to move that change along. It's up to us to bring democracy alive.